The vow shattered the moment Sienna Alden pressed her palm flat against the ancient seal carved into the obsidian floor of the Mordaine throne room, and every vampire in the chamber felt it break. It was not a sound so much as a pressure, a sudden absence of something that had existed for 600 years, like the snapping of an invisible wire strung between heaven and the underworld. The candles guttered, the shadows lurched, and Magnus Mordaine, Vampire King, sovereign of the Blood Court, ruler of every immortal soul in the eastern seaboard's hidden dominion, rose from his throne with eyes that had gone the color of burning copper and a face that was both terrifying and utterly undone. "What have you done?" he said, and his voice was not a shout. It was quieter than anything Sienna had ever heard from him, which made it worse. She stood her ground. Even though her hand was trembling and her heart was hammering so loudly, she knew every vampire in the room could hear it. The broken seal beneath her palm had drawn a thin line of red across her skin, but she did not flinch from it. She had not come this far, learned this much, or sacrificed what she had sacrificed, to flinch now. "I broke the chain you didn't know how to break yourself," she said, "and I would do it again." For a moment, the throne room was absolutely still. 24 of the oldest vampires alive stood in their court, finery, silver-haired and marble-skinned, watching their king with expressions caught somewhere between reverence and genuine fear, because the ancient vow that had just been unmade was no small thing. It was the blood covenant of Vethrian, a binding forged in the dying years of the old world, sworn on Magnus Mordaine's own blood and soul, and it had held him in chains no one outside this court had ever been permitted to know existed. Until Sienna, she had not been supposed to discover it. She had not been supposed to survive long enough to understand it, let alone destroy it. But Sienna Alden had been surviving things she was not supposed to survive her entire life, and she was not about to stop now, not even when the most dangerous creature in existence was crossing the obsidian floor toward her with the deliberate, unhurried grace of something that had learned long ago, that speed is for those who are afraid, and Magnus Mordaine was afraid of nothing. Nothing, she corrected herself, except losing her. That was the secret she had found first. Before she had found the vow, before she had found the hidden chamber and the sealed record, and the truth about what the Blood Court had done to him 3 centuries before she was born. She had found the way he looked at her, and she had understood it because it was the same way she had been looking at him when she thought he wasn't watching, and that, more than the broken seal, or the shattered covenant, or the political earthquake, now radiating outward through every corner of the vampire world, was what had made all of this possible. She had grown up in the Alden household, which meant she had grown up knowing vampires existed. Her family was one of the 7 human dynasties formally recognized by the Blood Court, old money aristocrats who had maintained a treaty relationship with vampire kind since the 18th century. It was a relationship built on mutual benefit, discretion, and a very carefully maintained distance. The Aldens provided legal cover, financial infrastructure, and human world political access. The Blood Court provided protection, certain financial advantages that compounded beautifully over centuries, and a guarantee that no vampire under their jurisdiction would touch an Alden without consent. Sienna had grown up with that guarantee like a fence around her childhood, and she had spent the last several years of her adult life systematically learning everything there was to know about the world on the other side of it. She had a law degree from Columbia and a master's in antiquarian studies that her professors had found either impressive or unnerving, depending on their temperament. She spoke 4 languages, could read 2 dead ones, and had catalogued more vampire legal precedent than most of the court's own scholars. She had done all of this deliberately, methodically, because she had understood from a young age that the treaty between the Aldens and the Blood Court was not as equal as her father pretended, and that the only way to change the terms of any negotiation was to arrive at the table knowing more than the other side expected. She had not expected to fall in love. That had not been part of the plan. She had met Magnus Mordaine 14 months ago when her father, Elias Alden, had brought her to the annual covenant renewal, the formal ceremony that refreshed the treaty protections between the 7 human dynasties and the Blood Court each year. She had attended twice before, as a child and once at 19, but this time was different. This time her father had made clear that he was beginning the process of naming her as the Alden heir and formal representative, which meant this time she had to actually interact with the court rather than stand behind her father's shoulder and observe. She remembered the exact moment she had seen Magnus. He had been standing at the far end of the Grand Hall beneath the court's ancestral manor outside of Greenwich, Connecticut, a place that looked from the outside like an aggressively private club, and was, beneath 3 sublevels of granite and reinforced steel, one of the oldest functioning vampire courts in the Western Hemisphere. He had been talking to one of his senior advisors, a vampiress named Vasilieva, who was approximately 800 years old, and radiated the particular kind of cold authority that came from having outlived most of the civilizations she had ever lived under. Magnus had been dressed in a dark suit that was modern in cut but wore like armor on him, because he was the sort of person whose physical presence transmitted the same regardless of what century he happened to be dressing for. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the white skin and white hair that marked old-blood vampires, hair not the white of age, but the white of something purely, elementally other, like moonlight given mass. His eyes were a pale, mineral grey that shifted towards silver when he used his power and towards something darker when he was being careful not to. He had looked across the hall and seen her looking at him, and he had not looked away. That was the first thing she had noted. Most people, when they realized they had been caught staring by someone staring back, performed some version of a retreat. Magnus Mordaine had simply held her gaze with an expression she could not read at all, and then he had excused himself from his conversation and crossed the hall toward her with that measured, unhurried certainty that she would come to recognize as the most characteristic thing about him. "You are the Alden daughter," he had said, not a question. "Sienna Alden," she had said, and extended her hand, because she had been raised with enough social confidence to match the moment. "And you are not going to call me the Alden daughter twice." Something had shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something more restrained than that, but warmer. "No," he had agreed. "I am not." They had talked for 2 hours. The covenant renewal had proceeded around them in the formal, ritualized way it always did, with signatures and exchanges and the careful protocols that governed the relationship between their worlds, and Sienna had been present for all of it in the official capacity that her father intended. But the thread of conversation she had kept finding her way back to was the one with Magnus, which had moved from treaty history to court antiquities, to the particular legal tensions between vampire blood law and modern statutes in a way that she had found genuinely intellectually exhilarating, and that she could see, with a satisfaction she had tried to keep carefully off her face, he had found unexpected. He had not expected her to be that knowledgeable. She had known he wouldn't. She had not expected to find him interesting in return. She had been prepared for power and formality and the performance of ancient authority. She had not been prepared for the dry, precise intelligence underneath it, or for the way he listened with the complete, focused attention of someone for whom time was not a resource that needed managing. In the months that followed, the meetings had continued, structured at first around the legitimate business of treaty renegotiation that Sienna had initiated, correctly identifying several clauses that were outdated and disadvantageous to both parties in their current form. Magnus had agreed to the renegotiation with a directness that had surprised her father and delighted her, and the process had required regular meetings, document exchanges, formal sessions in the court's legal chambers, and what had gradually, undeniably become something that was not formal at all. She had noticed the protection first. Small things initially. When she arrived at the court's manor and the door was opened before she knocked. When she mentioned in passing that a particular senior advisor of another dynasty had made a comment she found threatening, and that man was quietly removed from any future sessions she attended. When she worked late in the court's library on a Tuesday night in November and appeared the next morning to find that the section she needed had been entirely reorganized and recatalogued overnight, with a note in precise handwriting that said simply, "I thought this arrangement might be more useful to you." She had taken the note home and read it 4 times. She had noticed the danger second. Not danger from Magnus, but danger around her. The way his world had edges that her world did not, and the way those edges had started moving closer. The vampire political landscape was not stable. It had not been stable for some time, for reasons that Sienna had begun to understand in pieces, none of them reassuring. There were factions within the Blood Court that resented the treaty relationships with human dynasties on principle. There were older powers, some nominally under Magnus's authority and some explicitly outside it, who viewed the renegotiated terms as weakness and the human heir responsible for proposing them as a threat that should be removed. She had been followed twice. The second time, she had been in a parking garage in Lower Manhattan at 11 o'clock at night, and the vampire who had cornered her there had been very clear about his instructions, which were not to simply frighten her. She had bought herself approximately 40 seconds with a collapsible baton she carried for exactly this kind of contingency and a degree of complete tactical calm that had surprised the vampire enough to slow his approach. Magnus had arrived in 38 seconds. She had asked him later how he had known. He had looked at her for a moment with that unreadable expression and then said very quietly, "I always know where you are," and she had not asked whether that was a security measure or something else, because she had understood that pushing Magnus Mordaine before he was ready to be pushed on something that mattered to him was both futile and unnecessary. He would come to it. She was patient. She had not known, then, about the vow. She had found out through the archive. The court's historical archive was housed 3 levels below the library, a vault of documented vampire history going back to the early medieval period, and Sienna had been granted access to it as part of the treaty renegotiation process. Access was not the same as understanding. Because the archive was organized according to a system that made sense to vampire scholars trained in an entirely different cataloging tradition, and the documents themselves were in a mixture of languages that included 2 she could read fluently, 1 she could manage, and 1 she had to learn specifically. She had learned it. The Blood Covenant of Vithrian appeared in the archive, not in the primary record collection, but in the restricted supplementary index, a category she had discovered entirely by accident while cross-referencing a precedent on dynastic succession. The document itself was written in the archaic court language of the old vampire nobility, dense with formal legal structure and the kind of phrasing that existed specifically to obscure its meaning from casual readers, and Sienna had spent 3 weeks translating it properly. What it said in plain language was this: 312 years ago, the previous Blood Court Council, the governing body that had existed before Magnus consolidated sole authority, had forced Magnus Mordaine into a binding covenant in exchange for their support of his claim to the kingship, following a succession crisis that had nearly torn the vampire world apart. The covenant was constructed with old-world blood magic, the kind that did not require consent to execute if the conditions of coercion were met, and it had bound him to a specific set of constraints on his power and his autonomy that were written into the covenant in the disguised language of duty and honor. The most significant constraint was this: Magnus was prohibited from acting against any member of the old council bloodlines in any way that would diminish their power, their holdings, or their authority within the court, regardless of what those bloodlines did or directed others to do. He could not name them as enemies. He could not move against them. He could not even formally acknowledge wrongdoing on their part in a court record, without triggering a clause that would have unraveled his kingship and returned the court to the fractured, violent chaos of the succession crisis. And the old council bloodlines, knowing exactly what they had bound him with, had spent 3 centuries doing precisely what that protection allowed them to do. They were the ones who had ordered the vampire in the parking garage. Sienna had sat in the archive for a long time after she fully understood what she was reading. Then she had gone back to her apartment, made herself a cup of tea, and thought about it with the same precise, methodical focus she brought to everything that mattered, which was considerable. She had thought about what Magnus had been carrying alone for 300 years, the knowledge that the people who had helped him secure his throne had also chained him to a covenant he could not break without destroying everything he had built. She had thought about the careful, painful way he had constructed his kingship within those constraints, holding everything together through the sheer force of his authority while the old bloodlines moved against him from the inside. and he could not stop them directly. She had thought about him telling her he always knew where she was, and she had understood for the first time the full weight of what that sentence cost him, because he could protect her in the gaps. He could be 38 seconds away. But he could not act against the people directing the threats, and the threats would not stop. The old bloodlines had tolerated her presence in the court because her family's Tritorici relationship was useful to them, in certain ways. But her renegotiated treaty terms had threatened those uses, and she had now been in Magnus's orbit long enough that the old bloodlines had drawn a conclusion about what she meant to him, a conclusion that was accurate, and that made her the most efficient lever available. She had thought about all of this for a long time, and then she had begun to do research on whether there was any legal mechanism under vampire blood law by which the blood covenant of Vithrian could be dissolved, revoked, or rendered void. The answer, buried in the most obscure corner of the archive's legal precedent collection, in a text written by a vampire legal scholar who had died 4 centuries ago, and whose work had been largely forgotten, was yes, there was one mechanism. It was an old-world legal concept called the Vithrian exception, named for the same archaic authority the covenant drew its power from. The exception held that any binding covenant of coercion, meaning any covenant entered into under duress, could be voided by an act of consensual sacrifice made by a third party who stood outside the original covenant and had no legal stake in its terms. The act had to be physical and deliberate, and it had to be made at the site of the original covenant's binding. The site of the original binding was the obsidian seal in the Mordaine throne room. A third party with no legal stake in the covenant's terms meant someone who was not a vampire, not bound by any aspect of blood law, and not a party to any treaty relationship that had even indirect bearing on the covenant's clauses. Sienna, by the terms of the renegotiated treaty she had herself proposed, which had replaced the old treaty structure with a new one that moved the Alden relationship outside the court's internal blood law jurisdiction entirely, was precisely and specifically that person. She had checked the logic 4 times. She had verified it against every related precedent she could find. She had let a week pass and checked it again. She had held the solution in her hands and looked at every possible reason it would not work, every alternative, every other path, and she had found none that resolved the problem as completely or as permanently. Then she had gone to the throne room. She had not told Magnus. She had known that if she told him, he would find a way to stop her, because Magnus Mordaine's most fundamental characteristic, the thing that ran beneath his authority and his power and his dangerous controlled composure, was that he was protective in a way that went beyond strategy or politics. He protected the things he loved with everything he had, and it sometimes made him blind to the fact that what he loved was also capable of protecting him. She had managed to get into the throne room by herself, because she knew the court's schedules with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, and there was a window of approximately 20 minutes on certain afternoons when the formal guard rotation did not cover the east corridor. She had gotten through the door before anyone reached her. She had pressed her palm to the seal. The Vithrian exception had required an act of consensual sacrifice. The blood that had risen from the carved obsidian had been the sacrifice, and the sacrifice had been consensual, freely given by a third party with full knowledge of what she was doing. The covenant had broken, and now Magnus was standing in front of her. 600 years of contained authority in a perfectly cut dark suit, and a pair of silver-grey eyes that were currently doing something complicated and enormous that she did not have an adequate word for. And she was holding her bleeding hand against her side and meeting his gaze, and trying to figure out what he was going to do next. What he did was reach for her hand. He took it with a gentleness that was strikingly out of proportion to everything else about him. Turning her palm toward the light and examining the cut with an expression she recognized now as the one he wore when something had frightened him and he was in the process of converting that fear into action. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded handkerchief, pressed it against her palm with steady, careful pressure. "You could have been killed," he said, still quiet, still the voice that was more dangerous for being controlled. "I could have," she agreed. "But the alternative was letting you stay chained to a covenant that was being used to hurt people for 3 centuries, So I evaluated the risk and made a decision." "You evaluated the risk," he repeated, and there was something fractured in his tone that she had never heard there before. "Magnus," she turned her hand over in his, holding the handkerchief in place herself, so that she could use her fingers to press against his. "I knew what I was doing. I knew what the mechanism required. I am not injured in any lasting way, and it worked." "It worked," he said, and looked up from her hand to her face. And the expression she found there was the one she had been waiting 14 months to see clearly, the one he had been keeping back behind all the control, and the careful authority, and the 3 centuries of learned wariness. It was not complicated at all. It was simply the face of someone who was looking at the person they loved, and had been looking at that person while carrying the knowledge that loving them placed them in danger, and finding for the first time that a door he had believed permanently closed had been opened. "It worked," she confirmed, and her voice was steady but only barely. "What happened next happened fast. The old bloodlines, the council tenants who had held the covenant over Magnus like a sword above his head for 3 centuries, had been watching the scene in the throne room via the surveillance systems that were supposed to be loyal to the crown, and were not. They had understood what the breaking of the seal meant within seconds of it happening, and they had moved. There were 5 of them, elder vampires, 3 men and 2 women, all of them ancient enough that their white hair was long and formal in the old world's style, all of them dressed with the studied elegance that old vampire aristocracy had developed over millennia of practicing the performance of power. They came through the throne room's secondary entrance with a speed that human eyes could barely track, and they came with the particular kind of cold intention that centuries of protected impunity had taught them. Their leader was a vampire named Gregor Vethron, which was not a coincidence. He was a descendant of the original Covenant's architects, and he had a face like a cathedral's carved stone and eyes the color of old ice. He stopped when he was 20 feet from Sienna and Magnus, and he looked at the broken seal, and then he looked at Sienna, and his expression was the most frightening thing she had seen in the court because it contained absolutely nothing. No anger, no surprise, no calculation. Just removal. "The human girl must be eliminated," he said. "The covenant cannot be reinstated if she has completed the exception. But her elimination removes the legal framework that allowed the exception. The void can be argued." "No," Magnus said. It was one word, and it moved through the air of the throne room differently than any other word Sienna had heard him speak. It was not the controlled quiet of his previous voice. It was the full, unrestrained authority of a 600-year-old vampire king, who had just had every chain that bound his power removed, and who was now positioned between the threat and the person he was protecting, and who was done. Gregor Vethron had lived 800 years, and was not easily impressed. He was impressed now. She could see it in the almost imperceptible stillness of someone recognizing for the first time what they had been underestimating. "You have no legal basis to act against us," Gregor said. "The Covenant's dissolutions does not erase the precedents built on its foundation. We have 3 centuries of court rulings. 3 centuries of court rulings built on a covenant of coercion," Magnus said, "are not precedent, they are evidence, and I intend to use them as such." Sienna watched Gregor process this and find that the calculation he had been prepared to run no longer operated on the terrain he had mapped. Because Magnus was right. The Covenant's dissolution did not simply remove the constraints it had placed on him. It exposed the entire scaffolding that the old bloodlines had built around it, and that scaffolding, examined in light of the Vethrian exception and the original Covenant's nature, was not a legal fortress. It was a paper construction that had only ever held because the king whose power it constrained had not been able to say so openly. He could say so now. What Gregor Vethron did next was not what Sienna anticipated. He had been calculating while Magnus spoke, and he had arrived at the same conclusion she had, which was that the legal ground had shifted in a way that was not immediately recoverable. So he did what the old-world vampire nobility did when legal ground failed. He moved to the physical. Because 800 years of survival had taught him that power ultimately resolved not in courts but in force, he moved towards Sienna. Magnus moved faster. She had known, abstractly, from 14 months of proximity to the court, that Magnus was extraordinarily powerful by vampire standards. She had read accounts. She had seen the deference, the physical caution that other vampires showed around him that went beyond social hierarchy. She had never seen it expressed directly and without restraint, and what she saw in the next 4 seconds redefined her working model of what the word power meant in this context. Gregor Vethran was stopped before he crossed half the distance to her. Not by Magnus moving to intercept him, exactly, but by something that originated from Magnus in a way she could feel in her chest. A pressure like a change in atmospheric conditions that was targeted and specific, and that hit Gregor like a wall. The elder vampire was driven back 3 steps by something that was not visible, and not physical in any mechanical sense, and he stood there with an expression she had never expected to see on an 800-year-old's face, which was shock. The other 4 had not moved. They were watching their leader, and they were very still. "You will leave this court," Magnus said to Gregor, and there was not even heat in it, just the flat and absolute certainty of something immovable. "All 5 of you will leave this court tonight. You will liquidate your holdings within court jurisdiction within 30 days. You will not return. The formal record will document the terms of your exile and the reasoning behind it, which will include a full account of the blood covenant of Vethrian, its coercive origins, and the 3 centuries of actions you took under its protection. Every court on every continent will receive that record." Gregor had recovered enough to speak. "You cannot exile the founding bloodlines without a full council hearing. Blood law requires—" "Blood law," Magnus said, "as it existed under the Covenant, no longer applies to my actions in relation to your bloodlines. The Covenant has been dissolved. If you would like to argue that point, you are welcome to remain and do so. I would find it clarifying to have everything on the record." The silence that followed was the longest Sienna had experienced in the court. Then Gregor Vethran, 800 years old, founding bloodline of the original court council, turned and walked out of the throne room. The other 4 followed him, the court's assembled witnesses. The 24 senior vampires, who had stood through all of this with varying degrees of controlled composure, remained very still for a moment. Then, one by one, they lowered their heads in the formal gesture of court acknowledgement, which Sienna had read about, but never seen performed in its full, collective form. It was not quite a bow. It was something more than that, an acknowledgement that carried 6 centuries of formal weight, directed at their king. Magnus stood and received it without any visible change in his expression, which was the way he received everything. Then he turned to Sienna. "Come with me," he said. He took her to his private study, which was on the upper level of the manor and was a room she had been in twice before, in formal contexts. A large space with the high bookshelves and controlled natural light of someone who lived primarily at night, but had built an environment for thinking rather than darkness for its own sake. He led her to a chair near the fireplace, and he knelt in front of her, and he removed the handkerchief from her hand and examined the cut again, with the same careful, precise attention he gave to everything. "It is not deep," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it should be cleaned." He stood and went to a cabinet, returned with a small first aid kit that was both incongruous and entirely characteristic of him, and proceeded to clean and dress the cut with the focused efficiency of someone who had taken care of injuries in many contexts over many centuries. His hands were very careful. She swatched his face while he worked. The extraordinary composure was still there, but something underneath it had changed. He looked, she thought, like someone who had just set down a weight so familiar that he had forgotten it was there, and was now in the early stages of realizing how his posture changed without it. "How long have you known?" he asked, without looking up from her hand. "About the Covenant." 4 months, she said. "I found it in the archive, the restricted supplementary index." He went very still for a moment. "The archive access I granted you was not intended to extend to the supplementary index. I know. I followed a cross-reference that shouldn't have led there, and once I found it, I read it, and I think you'll agree that reading it was the right decision." He was quiet for a moment and finishing the bandage with a neat, precise fold. Then he said, "You could have told me you found it." "I considered that," she said honestly. "I decided against it because I knew you would have found a way to prevent me from doing what I did today, and I was not willing to be prevented." "You were not willing to be prevented," he repeated. "Magnus." She waited until he looked at her. I know that you have spent 6 centuries building something worth protecting, and I know that the people who helped you build it were simultaneously using it against you. And I know that you have been carrying that knowledge alone because you had no legal way to address it that would not destroy what you built. I am not interested in your gratitude. I am telling you that I saw a problem that I had both the knowledge and the specific legal standing to solve, and I solved it. That is what I do. He looked at her for a long moment. The firelight did interesting things to the pale silver of his eyes. Why, he said. And it was not a question about the mechanism. It was a question about something else entirely, and they both knew it. She let out a slow breath. I think you know why. I would like to hear you say it, he said, and his voice changed again. All the formal layers of authority stripped back to something that was just him. She held his gaze. Because I love you, she said, and watching you be constrained by a vow that was never fair, that was never freely given, that was being used to harm people while you held everything together by sheer force of will, was something I was not prepared to accept when I had a way to change it. That is why. Magnus Mordaine, vampire king, 6 centuries old, who had survived things that defied ordinary reckoning, and built a court, and held an immortal world together, under a weight that no one had been allowed to fully see, looked at Sienna Alden in the firelight and said nothing, for long enough that she had time to wonder, with the first genuine uncertainty she had felt all day, whether she had miscalculated. Then he raised her bandaged hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, and the gesture was so deliberate and so unexpectedly tender that she felt her composure come apart at edges in a way that nothing else in the throne room had managed. You are, he said again her hand, the most remarkable person I have ever encountered in 600 years, and I have encountered a considerable number of people. That is a very diplomatically phrased declaration, she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected. He lifted his head and met her eyes. I am not being diplomatic. I have never needed to be diplomatic with you, which is one of approximately 40 things about you that are entirely without precedent in my experience. He paused. I love you. I have been trying to find a responsible way to address that for the better part of a year, which primarily consisted of determining whether there was any version of this that did not place you in greater danger than you were already in by proximity to the court. I had not arrived at a satisfactory conclusion. The Covenant placed me in danger, she said. The old bloodlines were using you to get to me. Without the Covenant, their protection evaporates, and you have 6 centuries of unrestrained authority to direct against anyone who tries to threaten me. So actually, the most logical safety strategy was breaking the Covenant. His expression shifted into what she had learned to recognize as the thing his face did, instead of smiling, a controlled warmth at the edges of his composure that was more meaningful than an open expression would have been. You solved my most intractable political crisis in a way that also happened to resolve your own primary security threat, using a legal mechanism you found in a section of my own archive that you were not technically authorized to access. Yes, she said. That is either the most brilliant thing anyone has done in this court in 3 centuries, he said, or the most alarming. I would argue both, she said. He stood, drawing her to her feet with a gentleness that still surprised her from someone so physically formidable, and for a moment they simply stood in the firelight of his study with her bandaged hand in his, and the particular quality of the quiet between them was unlike any quiet she had been in before. There are still complications, he said. Gregor and the others will challenge the exile in whatever external courts have jurisdiction. There will be political fallout from the Covenant's exposure. Several of my senior advisors are going to have extremely pointed questions. I know, she said. I have anticipated most of them. I brought documentation. He looked at her. I prepared a legal brief, she said. I have been working on it for 4 months. It covers the Vithrian exception's precedential basis, the evidentiary case for the Covenant's coercive origins, the argument for exile under post-Covenant blood law, and a proposed framework for the court's public record on the matter. I left it in the library because I was not entirely certain I would still be able to retrieve it after the throne room, but it is there. She paused. I also drafted a preliminary outline for the treaty revision that will be needed now that the legal landscape has changed. Magnus was quiet for a moment. You prepared a legal brief, he said. Before you broke a 600-year-old covenant, I find it helps to have materials ready. He looked at her for a long time, and then he did something she had not seen him do before. He laughed. It was not a large laugh, not theatrical, but it was genuine, a warm, low sound that changed his face entirely, and Sienna felt it in her chest like a door opening somewhere she had not known was closed. Sienna, he said, yes? I am going to ask you something, and I want you to tell me if the answer is no. All right, I am 6 centuries old. My world is complicated, dangerous, and going to require significant reconstruction over the next several years. I am not a person who does anything simply, and the political realities of the blood court mean that whatever relationship you and I are in will carry formal weight and formal attention that will be uncomfortable at times. He held her gaze. And I am deeply, entirely, irreversibly in love with you, and I would like very much for you to stay. She looked at him. She thought about the 14 months of conversations, and the 38-second rescue, and the reorganized library, and the note in precise handwriting. She thought about the weight he had been carrying, and the way he had carried it, and the way he had looked at her when she said she would do it again. I prepared a legal brief, she said, and a treaty revision outline. I did not do that for a person I was planning to leave. The warmth at the edges of his expression finally broke through fully, and what she saw in his face was something that 600 years of carefully maintained authority had rarely allowed anyone to see. Simple, complete joy. He drew her close, with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, his hand at her waist and his other hand still holding hers, and kissed her with the particular focused attention of someone who had been very patient for a very long time, and was now done being patient, and Sienna Alden, heiress of the Alden dynasty, antiquarian scholar, treaty negotiator, and the woman who had broken a 600-year covenant with a legal brief and a steady hand, kissed him back with everything she had. The weeks that followed were exactly as complicated as he had promised, and she had expected. Gregor Vethran and his allies attempted to challenge the exile through 3 separate external vampire jurisdictions, and the legal team that Sienna assembled to counter those challenges was, as the court's senior legal advisor Vasilieva noted, with visible appreciation, formidably prepared. The documentation Sienna had compiled on the Covenant's origins was comprehensive enough that the first 2 challenges were dismissed within days. The third went to a formal hearing before the Continental Blood Council, an arbitration body with authority over disputes between vampire sovereignties, and Sienna presented the case herself. She had never appeared before a Continental Blood Council before. The chamber was held in a building in Vienna that looked like a private law firm, and was in fact a private law firm on its upper 4 floors, with 2 subterranean levels that had been in use as a vampire legal forum since the 18th century. The council was composed of 7 senior vampires from different courts and bloodlines, and they had the particular quality of attention of people who had been practicing law for several centuries and had very little patience for argument that wasted their time. Sienna did not waste their time. She presented the case with the precision and efficiency that had characterized every piece of work she had ever brought to the blood court, and when the questioning phase began, she answered everything with the directness that tended to either impress or unsettle people, and in this case did both. At the end of 4 hours, the council withdrew to deliberate, and came back 40 minutes later with a ruling that validated the covenant's dissolution and the legal basis for exile, and set a precedent for the treatment of coercive blood covenants in court jurisdictions going forward. She found Magnus in the corridor outside the hearing chamber. He had been there for the entire proceeding, positioned to one side with the stillness he defaulted to, when he was doing something that required significant effort to remain restrained about, which in this case was not intervening in a legal proceeding that he was not formally a party to, and that his presence as a participating voice would have complicated. When she came out of the chamber, he looked at her face. Read the result in it before she spoke, and the careful restraint came off all at once. He crossed the corridor and pulled her close with a thoroughness that drew a startled sound from the junior court aide who had been waiting nearby, and pressed his mouth against her hair and held her with an intensity that she had come to understand meant he was very relieved about something and was not going to say so in more words than strictly necessary. "You won," he said. "We won," she corrected, against his shoulder. "I did the presenting, but the case was built on your archive and your history and 6 centuries of evidence that you held together long enough for someone to come along and document it properly." He was quiet for a moment. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the formal implications." "I have also been thinking about those," she said. "Though the court's relationship with the Alden dynasty will need to be reconfigured in light of the new treaty framework. The position of formal human liaison to the blood court has not been filled in its current capacity since the old treaty structure existed, and the new framework creates a role that is essentially different in nature." "I wrote a job description," she said. She felt him exhale. "Of course you did. It is in the brief, Appendix 7. She tilted her head back to look at him. "It also includes proposed compensation, a security protocol, and a clause about not being required to attend any formal court function that starts before 10 in the morning, because I have limits." "No function in this court starts before sundown," he pointed out. "Then I expect we will not have a conflict on that point." He looked at her with the expression that was his version of a smile, and she looked back at him with the full, uncomplicated warmth that she had stopped trying to manage approximately 6 weeks into knowing him, when she had realized that managing it around Magnus was both futile and, on reflection, something she did not actually want to do. The formal announcement of their relationship to the blood court came 3 weeks later, at a full session of the senior court membership. Magnus made it in the direct, unadorned way he made everything, which was to state the fact and the relevant information, and then simply remain in whatever silence followed, with the composure of someone who found other people's discomfort at plainly stated facts to be their own problem to resolve. The court membership received it with varying degrees of genuine welcome and political calculation, which was exactly the spread that Sienna had modeled in her assessment, and the political calculation ones found, when they attempted to find angles of objection, that the legal framework she had built around the situation was not especially amenable to objection. Vassilieva, who had been in the court for 8 centuries and had therefore seen approximately everything at least once, waited until the formal session concluded, and then found Sienna in the library with the slightly different quality of attention she reserved for things she actually respected. "You are either going to be very good for this court," she said, "or extremely disruptive." "My working model suggests both," Sienna said. "Yes," Vassilieva said, with something that might, on another face, have been warmth. "I thought so." The manor in Greenwich became increasingly familiar to Sienna over the following months, until the distinction between her apartment in the city and her presence at the court became something she thought about less and less. The work was real and consuming, and genuinely interesting, in the way that the best work always was. Because the reconfiguration of the treaty framework for all 7 human dynasties was a project of substantial legal complexity that drew on exactly the combination of skills she had spent her adult life building. She worked with Vassilieva on the court's internal law review. She worked with the human dynasty representatives on new terms that were more genuinely equitable than anything that had existed under the old structure. She built a practice and a presence that were hers, that existed because of what she had brought and what she continued to bring, and that coexisted with the undeniable fact of Magnus in a way that felt not like compromise but like a natural geometry. Magnus was, she discovered progressively, exactly as complicated as the 600 years suggested, and also considerably easier to love than any of that complexity implied, because the same quality that made him so effective as a king, the absolute directness of his attention and intention once given, made him a very uncomplicated partner. He was not good at small performances of affection, not inclined toward the kind of social navigation that most relationships involved. What he was very good at was being exactly where he said he would be, doing exactly what he said he would do, and paying the kind of focused, complete attention to Sienna and to the things that mattered to her that she had rarely found anywhere, and found here with a consistency that still sometimes surprised her. He learned, over months, that she needed certain amounts of quiet time and structured work to remain in good balance. She learned that he processed difficult things through extended silence that was not the same as distance, and should not be interrupted in the early stages. He began making sure that the parts of the manor she used most frequently were organized in ways that suited how she worked. She began, in the hours before the court's evening activities required his formal attention, sitting with him in the study while he worked, which did not require either of them to speak, and which had a quality of comfortable presence that she had not previously known was something she wanted. He told her, in pieces and over time, about the 3 centuries of the Covenant. Not as confession or trauma, but in the way that someone with 6 centuries of history recounts things when the relationship has become the right vessel for them. She listened with the quality of attention that she gave to the things that mattered, which was complete, and she did not try to resolve what could not be resolved or make easier what could only be witnessed. Sometimes that was all that was required. He told her about the succession crisis that had preceded the Covenant, the years of genuine chaos in which the vampire world had been fractured and dangerous in ways that made the recent political complications look small. He told her about the choice he had made in accepting the Covenant's terms, knowing even as he signed it that the terms were not fully what they appeared, but believing that the alternative was worse. He told her that he had been right about the alternative, wrong about how much the terms would cost over time. "Would you make the same choice?" she asked him once. He considered it for a moment. "I would make a different one," he said. "But I am not certain the different one was available in the moment I had to choose. I had what I had." "That is either wisdom or rationalization," she said. "Often the same thing over enough time," he said, and she couldn't argue with that. The Alden family was, in the diplomatic phrasing, adjusting. Her father Elias had his own complicated feelings about the situation, which he had expressed in the controlled, formal way. He had always expressed things he was not entirely comfortable with, but could not argue against on practical grounds. The treaty renegotiation had been objectively good for the old interests. The new framework was objectively better for all 7 dynasties. His daughter was doing work that was objectively important, and for which she was objectively well suited. The fact that she was doing it in the context of a relationship with the Vampire King was something Elias was processing in a manner that would likely take some time. Sienna had a long conversation with him that was frank, in the way that conversations with her father needed to be frank in order to reach anything real. She told him what she had found in the archive. She told him what she had done. She told him why, and she told him that this was not a situation she was asking permission for, because she was 29 years old and had not needed her father's permission for the choices in her life for some time, but that she would like, genuinely, for him to understand it, because she loved him and his understanding mattered to her. Elias Alden was a person who had spent his whole life managing relationships between 2 worlds from a position that required him to never fully inhabit either, and Sienna thought that what he saw when she finished talking was a daughter who had gone into both worlds fully and found something on the other side that was more real than the careful middle ground he had always occupied. He had sat quietly for a while after she finished. "He will protect you," he finally said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said, "but I also protect myself and I protect him, and I think that is actually the right structure for the situation." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Your mother would have liked him." She liked people who didn't waste words. It was, from Elias Alden, approximately the highest form of approval he knew how to give, and Sienna recognized it as such and held it accordingly. The exposure of the blood covenant of Vithrian, as Sienna had anticipated, had reverberations in the broader vampire world that extended well beyond the specific exile of the old bloodlines. Courts in Europe and elsewhere had their own histories of coercive binding instruments, their own suppressed records, their own political structures that had been built on arrangements that did not entirely bear examination. The continental blood councils ruling in Vienna had set a precedent that made those arrangements less stable, and several courts approached Magnus and the Blood Court over the following year, seeking guidance on how to begin the process of review and reform. Sienna was, by this point, deeply involved in that process, because the legal framework she had built for the Blood Court's restructuring was the most comprehensive existing model, and because she had, Through the sheer accumulated weight of demonstrated competence and the formal position that had been built around her role, become a figure in vampire legal circles who was known and sought after in her own right. She found this mildly amusing and extremely interesting. Magnus found it, she suspected, a source of both satisfaction and the particular brand of focused protectiveness that he expressed through making sure she was never in a context without adequate security, which was something she had stopped arguing about after it became clear that his definition of adequate was actually quite reasonable and not, as she had initially worried, going to amount to a guard posted outside her office door at all times. What it did amount to was that when she traveled for court business, he came, not always in a formal capacity, sometimes as himself, which was sufficient because no one with any knowledge of the vampire world needed to be told that the presence of Magnus Mordaine was its own security protocol. She had made her own peace with this arrangement, which had taken approximately 2 weeks before she admitted that his company was something she actively wanted rather than simply tolerated. She had told him this in the particular direct way she had with him. "I like it when you come," she had said. "I want you there. I am not telling you this because I think you need to hear it to keep doing it, but because it is true, and I don't see any reason to make it smaller than it is." He had looked at her with that full attention quality and then said, "I would follow you anywhere," in the quiet voice that he used for things that were absolute, and she had put that sentence in the category of things she was going to keep for the rest of her life. 1.5 years after the covenant broke, on a winter evening when the manor's grounds were covered in snow that caught the light of the windows in a way that made the outside look like something out of another century, which she supposed it partially was, Magnus came to find her in the library where she was working and stood in the doorway for a moment in a way that she had learned to read as preamble to something significant. She set down her pen and gave him her full attention, which he had always responded to. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the formal structure of things." "We do seem to return to this topic periodically," she said. "We do," he agreed. He came into the room and sat across from her at the library table, which was unusual enough that she paid closer attention. Magnus did not sit at tables in libraries as a general habit. He stood, or he occupied the kind of chair designed for someone who approached comfort as a deliberate choice rather than a default posture. Sitting at a table was what he did when he was being deliberately ordinary, which she had noticed he did when he was trying to reduce the formidable quality of himself in a way he considered productive. She found it touching every time. The court's formal framework includes a recognized status for persons of significant permanent relationship to the sovereign, he said. It is an old category. It predates the covenant. It carries specific rights and specific protections within vampire law, including standing in court proceedings and certain formal acknowledgements from other courts. "I know that category," she said. "I have read the relevant precedent. It is approximately 900 years old, and the language is genuinely terrible." "The language is terrible," he agreed, "but the protections are real and permanent and would formalize, under blood law, a relationship that currently exists in something of a legal grey area that I would prefer to remove." "You are doing something right now," she said, "that looks like it is going to end with you asking me something important in a way that is structurally disguised as a legal discussion." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that a problem?" "No," she said. "It is extremely you, and I have come to have strong feelings about things that are extremely you." The warmth broke through his expression again, and he reached across the table and took her hand in his, and for a moment he was simply looking at her with 6 centuries, and everything those centuries contained behind his eyes, and something that was entirely just him in the foreground. "Sienna," he said, "will you stay? Not in the provisional, ongoing sense of what we have been doing, but in the formal, permanent, legally documented, I am asking you to be mine and to let me be yours sense." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the seal on the obsidian floor, and the note in the library, and 38 seconds, and the Vienna hearing chamber, and everything in between. She thought about the way the manor had become somewhere she recognized without trying, and the way his presence in a room was something she was aware of the same way she was aware of the quality of light. "Yes," she said, "with one condition." He raised an eyebrow. The formalization document will be in language that does not require a specialized dead language dictionary to pass, she said. I will draft it myself if necessary. You will absolutely draft it yourself, he said, with the full warmth that she still, even after all of this time, found extraordinary to see. It will be the best formalization document in the history of the Blood Court. It will be the most legally precise formalization document in the history of the Blood Court, she corrected. Whether it is the best is a matter of taste. My taste, he said, has been consistently excellent, and she laughed. And he kissed her across the library table with the snow falling outside the windows and the fire going in the grate. And everything that had been broken and rebuilt, and hard-won and carefully constructed was present in that moment, which was also simply a moment, warm and real and theirs. The formalization ceremony, conducted 6 weeks later in the court's formal hall with the full membership in attendance, and the documentation signed and registered in the Continental Blood Council's official record at Sienna's specific insistence, was as precise and legally comprehensive as she had promised. Vasilyeva had reviewed the document and declared it, in the most formal compliment she was capable of, entirely adequate. The court membership attended with the mixture of genuine warmth and political attentiveness that characterized everything they did, and several of the senior members, who had been most cautious in the early days of Sienna's presence, had arrived at positions of genuine respect that were visible to anyone paying attention. Sienna was paying attention. She always was. Magnus stood beside her through the ceremony with the composure that was his natural habitat, and also, in this specific context, a thin veneer over something she could see underneath it with the clarity that came from knowing him as well as she now did, which was simply happiness. He was happy. It was not an expression he wore with the uncomplicated openness that other people did, because 6 centuries of sovereignty and 6 centuries of carrying things alone had built a relationship between him and uncomplicated openness that was, to put it generously, cautious, but it was there. In the way he held her hand, and in the quality of his attention when he looked at her, and in the fact that when the formal portion concluded and the assembled court moved into the more informal reception that followed, he stayed close to her side, not because the political situation required it, but because he wanted to. She knew the difference. She had always known the difference. Later that night, when the manor had quieted and the snow was falling again, and the study fire had burned down to something steady and low, she sat beside him in the chair she had claimed as hers, in the way that possession of chairs in shared spaces accumulates quietly over time, and she was reading and he was working through something in the document files that required his attention, and the quality of the quiet between them was the particular quality she had discovered she loved most, which was the quiet of 2 people who were entirely comfortable in the same space and not performing anything. "Magnus," she said. He looked up. "I want you to know," she said, "that I am aware of what this cost you, all of it. The covenant, the years before it, the years under it, the things you built and held together under impossible conditions. I know that none of what we have now was simple or free, and I know that you carried most of it in a way that most people never had to understand." He was quiet, looking at her with the full attention. "I also want you to know," she said, "that I consider it a privilege to be the person you let see it, and that I intend to be here for as long as you will have me, which I believe based on the relevant documentation is formally forever, and I am entirely comfortable with that." He set down the document he had been holding, and he reached across and touched her face with the same careful, deliberate gentleness that he brought to every physical thing between them, which she had come to understand was not restraint but a kind of reverence, and he looked at her for a long moment with everything he was and everything he had been and everything that lay ahead of them both. 6 centuries, he said quietly, is a long time to learn to be careful with things that matter. "Yes," she said. "And then," he said, "you walked into the grand hall with a handshake and a position that said you would not be called the Alden daughter twice. And I understood that I was going to have to revise a considerable number of assumptions," she smiled. "Good. I prefer when my assumptions are better than my counterparts." "Your assumptions," he said, with the full warmth she loved, "are extraordinary. You are extraordinary. And I spent 6 centuries not knowing what it felt like to have someone fighting alongside me, and I do not intend to spend any further time without it." She closed her book and leaned into him, and his arm came around her with the naturalness of everything that had been built between them over all these months. And the fire burned low and the snow fell outside, and the manor held them in its ancient walls, and Sienna Alden, who had grown up knowing that the world had two sides and had chosen to understand both of them fully, thought that this was what it felt like when things resolved completely, not without cost. Not without the complicated years behind them, and the complicated work still ahead. Not in any way that was simple, because nothing about the life she had built in this world between two worlds was simple, and she would not have had it any other way, because simple was a kind of smallness that had never suited her. But resolved, whole, found. Magnus pressed his mouth against her hair and held her with the certainty that was the most characteristic thing about him, and outside the snow was covering the grounds, in a quiet that belonged to neither the human world nor the vampire one, but simply to the night which they both inhabited, which was the oldest and most honest truth about the place where they had built something together. The vow had been broken. The chains were gone. And what remained when everything that had constrained and hidden and distorted was removed was something that neither of them had names quite adequate for, so they held it instead, steadily and completely, in the warmth of a room that had become theirs, in the life they were making from everything they had been before they found each other, and everything they were becoming now. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.